Hi everyone, my name is Mio Murdoch. I am an undergraduate student at Boise State University. This is my capstone project on the behavioral effects of the Chinese social credit score system, and I hope you enjoy. So, to begin, what is the Chinese social credit score system? It's CS for short, or CSC. What it is essentially is a system that ranks people based on their trustworthiness in society, and it ranks not only individuals but companies and governments like local governments and government figures by assigning a score. These scores are impacted by your actions every day, so whether that's jaywalking, crossing the street. Wow, I was about to say jaywalking, crossing the street at the same time. Jaywalking, running a red light in your car, drinking too much alcohol, playing too many video games, not paying back your loans on time, um, just a variety of actions that can impact your score. If they're deemed good behavior, they'll increase your score. If they're deemed bad behavior, it'll decrease your score. All right, so let's get into the hypothesis. My theory is that if the Chinese social credit system works, then we will see a significant improvement in the categories measured. Um, we're looking for statistical significance, so we're looking at the 5% p-value or 0.95% p-value. And then if not, then we're going to try to look for explanations as to why not. Um, and then some assumptions we're making. We're making three main assumptions. The first is that the CSCS is widely installed in the country. I went with 50% or more of the population is affected by it. That's honestly just a ballpark estimate. There's no real basis behind it, aside from I felt like that was an appropriate number. The second assumption was that citizens want to maximize their credit score. They want their credit score to be as high as possible. They want the highest trustworthiness possible. They want that because the benefits associated with it are pretty good. When you have a high credit score, you don't have to pay the deposit on your apartment, possibly. You may also gain like special privileges as a citizen. So it's just generally speaking a good thing. And then people will want to associate with you more if you have a higher credit score. It creates a little bit of like a classism system. And if you have a low credit score, then you lose access to certain rights like transportation, being on the internet for too long, just like general stuff like that. And then the third assumption is that there's no incentive in the US and India, which are other two countries for comparison, beyond what's illegal and legal. There's no like moral bounds as to why people act a certain way. It's illegal and you're gonna get fined for it. So let's move on. Okay. All the data that I collected was from the World Bank and Our World in Data. They're two organizations that gather data from other countries and about countries around the world. They compile it and then they just compare. The World Bank, as many people know, is an incredibly reputable source, and Our World in Data is very similar. They have very strict procedures for data gathering, reporting, and then distribution. So they're highly reputable sources. That's where all my data came from for analysis. And this is the four graphs that I came up with. The first is crime rate by country. So clearly, if you commit a crime in China, if you commit a crime, your social credit would go down. So I was looking for statistical significance with crime rate decreasing in China. I compared it to the U.S. To use as kind of a baseline reference for a modern country that's also highly developed. I used India because it has a very similar population. It's geographically similar, so the values might be more aligned. And then also, it's a rapidly developing country, very similar to China. Um, and here's what our data looks like. So, in terms of linear trends, we see that generally speaking, crime is on the decline, not only by countries but by a world standard. So there wasn't anything really incredible about that. And then if you look at when the Chinese social credit score system was installed, which was around 2015 to 2020, um, you'll see that there really isn't a major decrease, a significant one in the trend line between here and here. It's very, and well, I should say here and the rest of the data. I'd say it's not statistically significant. Ran the numbers, they were not as well. Then we looked at India, which is right here, in the US, and they also weren't statistically significant. So, no real conclusion drawn there. Moving on, we have mortality caused by road traffic. Um, China has notoriously bad traffic. People are really, I don't want to say bad drivers, but they're insensitive on the road. People speed, people almost hit pedestrians all the time, and it's a huge problem. So I was thinking, well, the Chinese social credit score system measures drivers as well and decreases their credit score depending on if they're driving's good or bad. So here we go. I have the traffic mortality rate, and we see China has decreased, certainly, but not at a rate that's more impressive than the U.S. I mean, their linear trends are very similar, if not the U.S. is a little more aggressive than China's is. I will say in the past couple years of data, maybe from 2014 or 2015 to 2019, the decrease is a lot more pronounced in China. But also, I mean, you have to look at the numbers overall, and just China has, even if you go to the last year, I mean, China still has 18 more mortality per 100,000 than the U.S. does. The U.S. is at, what are we sitting at? We're sitting like 12 and a half, maybe 13. So I didn't really find that to be convincing either of an effective system or the system having effect in that regard. Next is loan interest rate. This is another category. If you've got a high credit score, then you get special benefits. So I was thinking, well, you would probably see a decrease in interest rates because people would be more trustworthy, and then if they were more trustworthy, then they wouldn't need as high of an interest rate on the loan, because if you don't think you're going to lose your money, then banks can hand out as many loans as they'd like to, without the fear of default. Therefore, they could have lower interest rates. Now, China was interested in this one. They already have a very low interest rate. It's very similar to the U.S. But again, the U.S. has the U.S. and also India has a much more negative linear trend than China does in the past couple decades that this data has been being gathered. And in addition, these past couple years, China flatlined on their interest rates. So I found no evidence there of a change. And finally, we have alcohol consumption. It was reported that an increase in alcohol consumption led to a decrease in your social credit score. So I found, well, let's maybe see if alcohol consumption decreased in China. And I apologize in advance. I couldn't get these bottom numbers to line up, but these are the years of the data. So we got 2009, 11, 13, 15, and 17. And China has actually had an increase in alcohol consumption. And then if you want to say, well, let's go to after the system was installed, we can say from 15 to 17, we've seen the slightest decrease. And this is, I will agree, flawed data in that regard, but still no significant decrease or anything really worth noting. So what does this lead to as far as an analysis goes? What's the story behind the data? I'd say overall we see a decrease in China's China has a generally speaking positive trend in terms of behavior. Their mortality is decreasing, their crime rate's already very low and it's decreasing. Their alcohol consumption is realistically at a fine level. um, and their loan interest rates are pretty solid. Um, does this make sense? I would argue, even without the social credit system, yes, that's been the general trend for the past 40 years across all the data. So that makes perfect sense that it would be decreasing still. And should we draw conclusions yet? No, I'm going to say that would be a brash move to draw a conclusion, but let me include one more part that I found to be incredibly fascinating, and that is nudge theory. So I went into a little bit more of the behavioral side of it, and I found this idea. It's called nudge theory, and it's the idea that positive reinforcement and indirect suggestions impact group and individual behavior. So I'm thinking the Chinese social credit score system is probably based slightly off of nudge theory and the idea that if you incentivize good behavior, you'll slowly and surely impact people to act in a way that you want them to by encouraging that behavior. So that's personally where I think the basis for the Chinese social credit score system lies in, and we haven't seen an incredible amount of evidence to support this idea yet that it works, but I would argue that it most likely does, and it has made an impact. So, moving on. Now, this is a little bit of a different take, and this may not be appreciated, but I recently made a friend who's from China. He works for Apple. He hacks iPhones. He jailbreaks iPhones, and I met him on a trip that I went on for a week, and I got to talk to him, and I talked to him about the Chinese social credit score system. I was like, this guy is from here. He obviously knows something about it, and I asked him, K, that's his name, K, do you know anything about the Chinese social credit score system and how it works? And he responds to me with the statement, what? What's the Chinese social credit score system? And I was taken aback entirely by this person who's a native from China who did not know the system that I had been researching for the past couple of months. I was blown away that he had no clue what I was talking about. So I dug a little deeper and I asked him, you guys have to have like credit scores of some kind, and then your good behavior makes your score worse, your bad behavior, your good behavior makes your credit score better, your bad behavior makes your credit score worse. He says, I've never heard of anything like that. We don't have that system in China. So I said, well, what do you have? And this is what he showed me next. So these are two apps that he had on his phone. And one is a car rental app, and that's the image on the left. And it's showing it shows like your credit score, and then which would be this 600 number right here, and what you could get with that credit score. Very similar to a FICO credit score of some sort, most likely. And that just gives you the rate on that car, how much you're gonna pay for it, and then yeah, it tells you some of the features as well. And then moving over to this right side, this is a record keeping of promises, as he called it. So this is financial obligations and you keeping up with them. And I believe it's called a Sesame score in China. It's very similar to that. It's essentially just a FICO credit score. It's the exact same thing, except it's partially run by the government instead of in the U.S. with our capitalist system. So that was fascinating to hear about. And I asked him, well, does your behavior impact any of this? And he's like, no. The one thing that he did say was that the Chinese government does prevent you from buying high-speed train tickets or flights if you do have a poor credit score. But that mostly and entirely is for people that have debt obligations and are like wildly in debt. So it's mostly people that are in a financial burden or setback, and they're prevented from buying these planes and train tickets. And the craziest part was that in Western media, it's been portrayed that your actions, just like your day-to-day interactions with people, could impact your score to a point where you wouldn't be able to travel. Let's see what the next slide is. I'll go back. This is showing us mostly, in my opinion, a flaw of Western media and of Western perspective. It was astounding to hear from a native that he had no clue what I was talking about, and yet I had read 50, maybe 100 articles on this system that seemed like it was in place and working. And he said he didn't know about it, in that it was far too advanced for China to even do in the first place, and that they're just not there yet. He had never heard of it. And I think to an extent, it's also reasonable, what they have right now. I think it being run by the government, as much as I am not a fan of that, what's really the difference between that and companies running it? But again, this goes back to Western media not properly portraying what is going on in China and the biases that come across with that. And that's been a really important lesson that I've learned throughout this report, is that our biases in the West against Eastern ideas and practices has provided an incredibly skewed perception of what is going on over there. And the misinformation around this is incredible. I did not read a single article that accurately talked about this until I looked up different forms of credit in China, specifically like the Sesame credit score, which is the equivalent of a FICO score, which we already have in the US. But they didn't talk about that. They talked about the social score, not the Sesame score. So it was incredible to learn about the actual false existence of the social credit score. Yeah, so here's the conclusions that I've made from this and some lessons that I've learned. I am, first of all, not comfortable saying that the Chinese social credit score system has had an impact on China yet. For all I know, they may never implement a system like the Chinese social credit score system, like I've imagined and like we've seen in the West or thought of in the West, but maybe they will. We can't say. And more time's going to be needed to see its impact. We've only got about 5 years of data on this. COVID's definitely thrown a wrench also in the data collection for this. So I would not be comfortable drawing conclusions from data that we don't have just yet and not enough of it. So thank you so much for watching my presentation. I hope this wasn't too confusing or too long-winded. It was a really interesting process. I learned a ton. And thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed.